Ethiopia Counseling and Psychology Quotes. Do you have that? Got that? Okay, great. What this is I did some research before I came in journals, mental health and psychological journals, to just see what I could find about the state of psychology and counseling and mental health issues in Ethiopia. And I began to identify certain writers, certain scholars who were prominent. They publish a lot. They have a lot to say. And so I went through and I read a number of articles, and I pulled several articles that I thought were really insightful and helpful. Not that I understand, because one of the reasons we're going to have this conversation is I want to read these, and I want to dialogue with you about your perceptions relating to this. So these are scholarly articles dealing with the issue of counseling and mental health in Ethiopia by Ethiopian scholars. So in all of these articles, at least one of the authors is an Ethiopian who is a scholar either here or in another university, but who specializes in Ethiopian work in the field of psychology. So that's what this is. So on the first page, again, I don't have, all we're doing today is I'm going to read this, and I'd just like to get your thoughts. Anything you think, oh yeah, that fits my understanding experience. Oh, that doesn't fit my understanding experience. Oh, I just like to hear, because what you'll do, God willing, I'll be able to come back and do this again, and you'll be helping me train for the future by doing this, because I don't want to presume that what's said here is what you've experienced. So the first one is Modern Counseling Approaches in Ethiopia, Allied to the Western Systems. And I can send you the full articles if you want. Given how much you have to read, you probably don't want these. But the first quote there, Abdul Basit in his study also revealed the cultural perspectives of modern counseling and its application as opposed to Africans allied to the Westerners, stating that modern psychotherapy, which is what we talked about, that's the Freudian thing we talked about yesterday, as it emerged in the West, was deeply influenced by Western thinkers who represented the religious, cultural traditions, historic symbols, and narratives of Western society. Therefore, it has been argued that psychotherapy is a white middle-class endeavor from which non-white ethnicity are not likely to profit. Furthermore, it has been argued that ethnic match between client and therapist is essential for counseling to be beneficial. Any thoughts on that? It's interesting. There's something in this article that's really it's raising an interesting subject, which I think we all have to wrestle with in culture. The West has the capacity to spread ideas, and the question is, this is the question, and it's actually has a moral aspect to it. It has a ethical aspect. It has a philosophical aspect. What coming from the West is a help in any culture, and what coming from the West is actually destructive in any culture. There can be an assumption from the West that ideas from the West, like these ideas of psychology, are actually beneficial going into other cultures. One of the things we were looking at yesterday is that isn't necessarily so. In fact, as believers, we see these ideas, at least some of them, as potentially destructive. And so for you as pastors in Addis, who are going to be working between a cultural normative culture that everybody has lived in and a Western culture that is being included, you're going to have to be discerning what of the culture is helpful and what isn't. And I think you're going to find, and you're probably already finding, it's hard to know. That can extend to entertainment. It can extend to political ideas. In a global society, ideas are shared, but they often flow from the, I think the word they use now is income rich as opposed to income developing societies. They flow that direction simply because of the money. And so it'll be an interesting thing, and I think he's touching on that now, and he's actually, his article is a little bit pushing back on the idea that psychology coming into our culture is a good thing. Second quote from that article: counseling is a method of resolving personal or emotional problems through a special form of talking done between counselor or coach and the client. It assists to reflect the situations one encounters in life by the assistance of experienced or professionals to get to solutions of personal distress or interrelationship or differences through proper listening and talk. Counseling is a course of life among Ethiopians, since it begins right from the date of birth through development periods, even if the amount bestowed on the coaching may vary depending on the age and situation. He says a number of things that I'm curious what you think about, because when I read the top of that, it seems to fit some of the things we were talking about in terms of the counseling that comes from psychotherapy, or that idea of the professional. But then he switches and says this happens among Ethiopians from the date of birth. So how do you take that paragraph? How does that strike you? Because he seems to be saying two different things. So as people move from the countryside into the city, that relational community breaks down. And so what might have happened in a smaller area where you have strong relational connection, here in the city that's broken down. Everybody maybe is forced into individualism by being here. So maybe one way of thinking about it is the counsel in the traditional model is in areas that allow somebody to be productive in the community without regard to how they're doing internally or personally. We don't deal with how you're doing internally unless it affects the community. Yeah, there's an interesting thing we're talking about here. The word counseling is an English word. And one of the things that you guys as pastors might need to do as you're helping the church embrace the idea of this one-to-one personal ministry is to discover use terms that are not Western terms to describe what you're doing. So rather than saying come and receive biblical counseling, that might not be the best term, because you're with that word. In sociology, there's a concept, they call it social construct, right? So social construct is a term that can be filled with whatever meaning people want to fill it with. So it doesn't have a specific meaning. So counseling has a definition, but it is filled with whatever people believe it is. And so one of the things that might be good conversation in the church is How do we want? One of the reasons I move away in my church from talking about counseling is because people have an idea of counseling that comes from what we talked about yesterday. And therefore, for me to minister to them, I have to overcome those ideas about counseling to get to what I want to do. And so there may be language and terminology that you develop that fits this context that doesn't force you to have to battle with the counseling idea that comes from the West. So that's why I use personal ministry. Or I use pastoring. You know, let's have a pastoral conversation. I never use, yes, I'd be happy to counsel you. I never use that. I saw Michael say, you know, please meet with one of the guys for biblical counseling. He may be trying to say we're trying to institute the idea that what we do is biblical. But there may be a better way to say it for a good biblical conversation. So that's a good thing for you guys to think about. Well, actually, and in that regard, the idea of biblical counseling fits perfectly because at the basis of biblical counseling is that we are all counselors. The only question is, are we sound or unsound counselors? But everyone is always counseling. When you're parenting your child, you are counseling. You are offering input. When you are in fellowship and someone is asking you to pray and you pray for them, that's a form of counsel. So one of the ways to think about it is to build a church culture is to say we counsel all the time, but is it sound and biblical when we do it? If I share my opinion based on my experience, I might be counseling you, but is that sound counsel? So we try to do that with our church. We're not saying, okay, here are our counselors and these people are not counselors, or you need to be able to be this to be able to counsel. No, you're counseling every day. One man talked about what he calls unsought counseling. And so if you're driving in the city and another driver doesn't, and I see this a lot this week, and another driver doesn't like the way you're driving and they lay on their horn, right? That is unsought counseling. He is using his phone to bring a correction to your behavior. In our culture, when you do that, they lay on the horn, and then they come over and start yelling at you. And you just sit there like this. You don't look because you don't want to create a conflict. But that's counsel. He's counseling you. It's just not wise and it's not helpful. So I think one thing to do is just be thinking about this idea of how do we communicate the value of the biblical ministry, the one-to-one biblical ministry that can include pastors, but isn't just pastors. That it's us all, and how can we be better at it? How can we help marriages counsel one another better? That's a good thing to think. This next one is a fairly long quote, and so we're not going to unpack it heavily, but actually, we'll skip the one. There's one right there, a short one, that says, without consensus. The next one is a long one, begins prior to the advent of Western influences. And I'm going to read through this because I think he says a lot. We're not going to cover it. But mostly I want to get an idea of whether you think these studies fit your understanding. He says, prior to the advent of Western influences, the concept of psychology was relatively unknown, and there was no recognition of the need for psychiatrists or psychologists in Ethiopia. With the traditional system, etiology or methodology is often attributed to supernatural causes. Etiology simply means the way we think about something. Is often attributed to supernatural causes with the onus placed on the person for having done something wrong. Traditional classification of mental health difficulties denotes the severity of the condition and the level of responsibility that the individual holds. Severe symptoms typically need to be present before a person is considered to have a mental health difficulty. And these are just citations of studies where they're getting that from. Symptoms of depression are often perceived as the least important mental health difficulties, whereas symptoms of psychosis are seen as the most severe. Families are likely to care for those with mental health difficulties and rarely seek additional help. If help is sought, traditional healing methods are usually the first option, as this generally links most closely to the family's understanding of the cause of difficulties. Treatments are likely to be provided by a spiritual healer, a magical healer, or herbalist, and include rituals, herbal remedies, holy water, adorning amulets, as well as exorcism. Now he's talking about the culture broadly, I think. If traditional methods are unsuccessful and more acute difficulties develop, families may keep the person with mental health difficulties under restraint due to uncertainty about alternative ways of coping. If there continues to be no improvement, the family may choose to ask the person to leave the family home. Given that they are likely to be experiencing significant difficulties, finding alternative accommodation will often be challenging. Thus, the likelihood is that the person will become homeless. Given this traditional paradigm, the application of applied psychological approaches developed in high-income countries may have appeared incompatible, and the study of psychology may even have been considered something of an indulgence. So that study of tradition regarding these issues. Thoughts? Yeah. Well, I just want you to know, first of all, psychiatrists are medical doctors who've been trained in brain medicine, in particularly mental health. So they are, first of all, medical doctors. So they're not a PhD, they're an MD first. So that means that's what they do. So it's exact same in the States. If you go to a psychiatrist, you're going to get a prescription. And the psychiatrist will only meet with you for maybe 45 minutes. And he will listen to you and be diagnosing and getting ready to prescribe right then. You go to a different kind of person if you want to talk through your problems. I tell people, don't go to a psychiatrist if you want to talk about your problems. He'll have you out of there before you even get started. And they'll prescribe. And they should be, in the States, there are standards. You can't, the problem with medications we talked about yesterday is that it has side effects. And so somebody taking medication needs to have monitoring until they can determine whether those side effects are worse than the problem. So your friend probably may not have been taking them right, or may have been, sometimes they get mixed up with other medications. I was dealing with a woman, they call it stacking medications. So I was dealing with a woman who had a number of physical issues not related to mental health. And so she was going to this doctor for this issue, this doctor for this issue, this doctor for this issue, and this doctor for her anxiety. And this doctor was prescribing this, and this doctor wasn't looking at what this doctor was prescribing and prescribing this. And then this doctor was not looking at these two and prescribing this, and this doctor. And so she ended up with a stack of 7 medications that nobody was managing. And she was just taking all and the medications are interacting with each other. And so it made it very difficult to know what her condition was, because you couldn't tell what was the condition and what was the interaction of the drugs in her. That's very common. Or people who mix alcohol with drugs, or they mix other drugs with illegal drugs with drugs, or we talked about yesterday, they don't like the effect of a drug on them, so they take it some days and don't take it others. And so think your friend probably was doing everything they were supposed to do rightly, but sometimes that's one of the side effects is increased suicidal thoughts with depression medication. So, well, I'm sort of reading into this, but I think the kind of things that if it was depression, I'm thinking probably you're correct. Again, this is me speculating. But if it's a kind of mental illness that can create violence, that can be disruptive in a home, and it's destroying the family, which some mental illness can. It might be that, I know in the States that's what happens. Just go. Just send them out. Just a little bit, from my culture, because I think it's important to recognize that this issue is difficult in any cultural setting. In the move of people from the countryside into the city in our country took place about 150, 175 years ago. All of our big cities built up around then. And so what happened, very similar to what you're describing, the relational nature of community supporting and caring for one another began to fall apart as people moved toward the cities. And so when people came to the cities, those who came with problems, the question is, what do you do with them? And so they created what they called asylums, which were large facilities. They would take all the people who had significant mental illness issues and put them in a place. And in many cases tried to treat them, but didn't know how to treat them. Over time, they realized that they were getting full. Because nobody was getting healed, they were getting full, so then they would dump them back out into the street, which created a homeless problem in cities. That's one factor. When the idea of treating mental illness, severe mental illness, went through several places where it was very barbaric. They did shock treatments. You get familiar with shock treatments, right? So you put electrodes and you just shock the brain with electricity. And particularly for depression was one way they handled it. For other kinds of mental illness, they did what you call a lobotomy. They would do surgery and cut out the front part of the brain and leave the person alive but unable to function. And so places would be filled with people who could be led around to do things. But this is particularly for violent people, but they had no ability to process and think for themselves. There's a famous movie that came out in the 1970s called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and it's basically the story of a man who is put into this asylum, into this hospital, mental hospital, and his interactions with the system and how eventually they decide the only way we can control him is to cut out his brain. And so he's a man, the character was a man who was, you could tell the way he played him, he was really had a lot of problems, but he was also a man you could see his personality. And so the end of the movie is how they used surgery to remove his personality so that he would function but couldn't have a personality. So that's now illegal, but that happened for decades. That's how they treated certain kinds of mental illness. So a reason to say that is societies use various means that come from their cultural understandings on how to treat things. Our means was, let's remove them from the population and then fix them, or at least put them in a place where they can be managed. And now the big trend is community care. So they want people who are struggling with mental illness, significant mental illness, to be able to find that they'll have homes in communities where they all live together, and the idea is that you become part of the community. The challenge with that is that you're living in a community, but nobody accepts you in the community. And so it's not working that well either. So that's our culture with this. I'm simply saying that to say that cultures are dealing with it. And let me do this. Okay, here's the next one. Despite widespread poverty, some researchers have suggested that mental health difficulties are not as common in Ethiopia as in many high-income countries, which could further account for the limited role of clinical psychology. For example, claimed at the rate, Kibor claimed that the rate of mental health difficulties in America is higher than Ethiopia. Prevalence rates of mental health difficulties in Ethiopia have been estimated at around 11 to 12% of the population. In England, it has been found that 17.6% of adults have at least one common mental health difficulty, and a similar proportion has symptoms which do not fulfill diagnostic criteria. Lower prevalence rates would be consistent with the well-established finding that mental health difficulties are associated more strongly with relative rather than absolute poverty. The current statistic quoted for the United States is 26% of the population has a diagnosable mental illness issue in any given year. So 1 out of every 4 people could be diagnosed with a mental health problem in the United States. That raises a number of really interesting questions. Is that an issue because in the United States there is better awareness and diagnosis of mental illness? Or is that a situation where in affluent countries we have the ability to call more and more things we don't like mental illness? Yeah. And one of the things that we know is that one of the problem features of any mental illness is isolation and lack of relationship. So in a culture where there is community and there is relational connection, I think you would see less mental illness. Not that it's just that it isn't being diagnosed, that there actually is less of it. I think if you see in a culture where all your needs are met, but you're still told that what you have isn't enough, and life is entirely materialistic, and there is no awareness of the inner person that needs God, that needs something beyond. When you offer people material, what he's saying in this article, and he's basing this on a lot of studies, when you offer people material, it doesn't necessarily make them feel better about themselves. If I win, we have lotteries in our country. There's interesting studies that when people win lotteries, they win amounts of money. The overwhelming majority of the people who win lots of money regret they ever got the money because of the way it messes up their lives. So that's one of the things. There's a lot of interesting things in this right here, this idea of, because it gets at where does mental illness come from? Is it where I'll give you what I believe is my biblical answer. It comes from Romans 1. We serve the creature rather than the creator, and life falls apart because we do that. And a culture who's going to deny God and is going to seek other gods, particularly material gods, is going to have a greater dissatisfaction with life. Because this world is all they can get. And somebody else has more than them. Somebody always has more than you do. If you have if in our professional sports, probably here too, a basketball player might make $26 million US a year. play basketball. But if his team signs a guy to make $30 million a year, he is going to sit out until they match his salary. Because you cannot make more than me. That's professional sports. That's what happens. Because I have to be the highest paid, or at least equal to the highest player. I'm the key player. I have to be paid best. There's never a question of how much is enough. Because money is not, at this point, and this is the way the West functions, money is not what makes my life work. Money is what gives me value. Possessions are what gives me value. It's a house, it's a this, it's a this. It's the size of my television, whatever it is. Those things are status and value. So when you have that, you have a culture that has no grounding in anything solid, and I think that's why 26%. The other issue we have in our country that will be interesting that happens is there's a high connection in the United States between mental illness and drug abuse. And they work with each other. Someone who is abusing drugs will often, the drugs will affect them in a way that affects their mental health, obviously. Someone who has mental health issues because they're often on the streets, or they're marginalized, or they can't hold jobs, they're more susceptible to drugs as an escape. And so the drug connection, and part of that 26%, a lot of that is because there's drugs involved. Which means our homelessness is significant because it's both mental illness and drug addiction that puts people on the streets. So that's the U.S. A couple more. The reason we're doing this is I think for leaders, we never want to be focused, but we always want to be attentive, not only to what's happening in our larger culture, but how it's being understood by people who are studying it. Because these people right here are going to be the policy shapers that your people and your churches will have to respond to. They're the ones who are going to, for example, maybe, I don't know where it is right now, but in your public schools, say there is a mental health officer whose job it is to identify mental health among children in public schools to prevent, to keep children from falling outside the system. And that may affect the way they handle things like discipline. There's a lot of things that start to happen when policy gets developed out of this. So you as leaders, I wouldn't say the average person needs to be focused on this, but us as leaders, we don't want to just be thinking about what's happening, and we don't want to just be thinking about what trends might be. We want to know how people are interpreting those trends as leaders so that we can build in preparation for what's coming and we don't react to what's coming. So, we'll do one more long one. This is just, I'll just read this because I think it's interesting. This starts with the subtopics that emerged from the FGD, and there was a large study they did. The subtopics that emerged from the FGD identified 4 core reasons why participants felt religious practices such as using holy water, praying, reading the Quran, and consulting with families would be the most common and traditional approaches to address mental health and well-being issues. First, Ethiopians have been practicing Christianity since 4 BC, and the culture of Christianity and traditional Ethiopian culture became synonymous. In addition, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been one of the major institutions that claims to treat mental health issues. One of the participants in this large study stated, as a believer, you're expected to go to church or to tell your priest about your problems and use the recommendations of the priest, which oftentimes includes fasting, holy water, etc. There's a lack of public awareness about the different mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, adjustment disorders. Most people seek traditional medicine or holy water even without understanding their situations. Another participant said, The belief is that holy water heals any problems of well-being and health. This is the reason why most people prefer this option as their first. On top of that, holy water is the one place to be healed without getting diagnosis or learning what kind of problem one is facing. The third rationale for using traditional practices is that the counseling and psychology field are very young in Ethiopia, and people are less aware of the option of counseling. The infancy of scientifically based approaches, which is an interesting word, because this is not, most of what they're basing it on is not truly science, is related to the high stigma around seeking mental health interventions in Ethiopia, as opposed to the normative process of seeking help from the church. One participant said, most people use holy water not only for mental health and well-being issues, but to treat their physiological health, such as HIV/AIDS, partly because using holy water to treat your problem is not a stigmatized practice. But going to mental health hospital is the most stigmatized practice. The final topic that emerged during the discussions related to traditional approach to healing was participants' opinions regarding the incorporation of traditional methods in counseling practices. Participants agreed that traditional approaches to healing are an important consideration when thinking about how to make counseling useful in Ethiopia. The majority of participants were positively inclined toward the integration of traditional approaches of treatment as an option for mental illness. One participant specifically said, in our inpatient treatment, we allow patients to use holy water or keep their spiritual practices if our patient or his or her family want to do it. One of my clients, for example, hangs St. Mary's picture on her wall to pray every day while we, the psychiatric nurses and counselors, are treating her problems scientifically. Only 2 participants held that the belief the integration of approaches could have a major negative impact on clients due to conflicting belief systems. In other words, using holy water while also engaging in thought-stopping cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the positive self-help activities that we saw, could be seen as the individual questioning his or her faith. We're not going to talk about this one, but I think it's a great, at least I think that you're talking about mental health professionals in the culture trying to figure out how do we deal with the religious aspect of the culture as we try to help people. Can we integrate this or should we not? None of these are biblical. These are traditional Christian approaches or religious approaches. You'll face something like this, particularly perhaps with an older generation or people coming from the Orthodox Church who would have a hard time not using holy water if it's been done in generations in their homes, or they have family who say that. So one of the questions you would have to think about is if somebody wanted to use holy water as we're seeking to help them, how would we handle that? As somebody's transitioning from one culture, from a traditional religious culture to a biblical understanding. That's a really interesting question. So let me give you a scenario, and you can tell me where this fits this. Because, again, I'm talking from my ignorance, and you're helping me understand. And part of this is from my reference to the Catholic Church in the States. You have somebody in your church, and they have an aunt who is 60 years old, who's lived in the Coptic Church, the Orthodox Church, their whole lives, their world. They've been faithful. They've been committed. This has been their life. And then that person in your church shares the gospel, and God acts miraculously, as He always does, to convert them at that moment. And they come to your church, but they're struggling with anxiety. will they just say, you know what, I don't do that? Or would they feel a sense of shame to reject something that has been their whole life? Or would they feel like all these other people who know me, that's my question for you. How would they handle that? That's very helpful. Because I would, again, this is where you're helping me understand culturally better. My experience believing in Marxism and then one moment later believing in God, being an atheist and one more, I couldn't wash out all the Marxism at one time. A lot stayed with me in my thinking. Also, using drugs, though I knew they were wrong, is not something I stopped immediately. I was so affected by it, I would stumble. Our church is about 65% former Catholic, right? Because we live in a Catholic area. Many of those people were what we call nominal Catholics, which meant they were born in the church, but they really have kind of left it. They don't really go. They go for ceremonies. They know how to do the Mass. They know how to do it, but they don't really do it. And so when they come to Christ, the biggest issue is their tendency to not understand grace and continually fall back to, I need to do works to continue. And that's one of the biggest things we deal with. But we also deal with, for example, those who were baptized who don't want to be rebaptized because baptism is a rejection of everything my family stands for. Which it is. You know, it is. But it's not for someone who grew up in a nominal or Protestant mindset. Baptism is just what you do. But for someone where baptism is what makes you Catholic, parents can go to that Protestant church, I'm okay, but don't ever get baptized, because that's a rejection of everything and us. And then we have people who will sneak back to the Mass. They'll come to church on Sunday morning. They love Jesus. They're authentically saved. But their habit has been going to the Mass the night before. So as pastors, we have to decide, how do we help those people who are between their tradition and the call of the gospel? And we are dealing with the fact that we can't allow people to think you can bring the one into the other. But we don't want to make this action, which has no real value, the things that drive you away from God's people. So we're always trying to help people. So I don't know if you'll face that or not. It's not for everybody a changeover. Sometimes it's a process. One of the things I've learned is when someone is converted from another religion or non-religion or a strong philosophical view like I had, the thing that helped me most from what the Christians said is, only follow me as I follow Christ. Right? Don't conform to our culture. Follow Jesus. So I would not make issues of things that they needed to do to fit into our culture. I made issues of things where Jesus says, follow me, and put away this. And so the texts become, don't put your hands to the plow and then turn back. The text about father and mother, Jesus says all you need for them to hear. We don't have to say any more than Jesus has already said. And let's let Jesus be the one who who instructs them about how to live their life and not conform. Because the danger of somebody who has left one world, whether it's in our culture, this is what we're going to face with the LGBTQ culture, is they're going to leave that culture and have nothing. And if they have to simply start conforming to our culture, they may not survive. But if we can say, follow Christ, I have to have confidence as a pastor that the process Jesus has for them may not be my process, but it is the process for them. As pastors, let's make sure we don't load in legalism in the form of adapting to our culture. And let's let Jesus be the Lord who calls them to follow. And then when they're faced with temptation to go back, it won't be, what will the pastor think? It'll be, what does Jesus say? That's the important point.